My name is Michal Kolmaš. I'm an assistant professor of international relations and Japan studies or Asian studies at Metropolitan University Prague, where I'm also the deputy head of the Asian studies department. I specialize in Japanese foreign policy, in Japanese society, and quite recently I've started working on the role of climate change in state discourses. Well, Japanese perception of V4 region is, I don't think that it's that important for Japan. Now, V4 region is, of course, of some importance to Japan, and the relationship between Japan and the V4 countries have been here for more than 100 years. Mostly we're celebrating 100 years of Czech-Japan relations, but Poland was 1919, Slovakia was also 1920, of course, with us. Austria-Hungary, it's almost 150 years. But for most parts of this history, the relations were very shallow. Like during the communist times, obviously, the relations were almost non-existent because trade relations were non-existent or almost non-existent, and political relations were in the framework of Soviet Union-Japan cooperation. Now, it's true that there were new contacts between Japan and V4 countries since the 1950s, but only after the communist Union collapsed did Japan build up on those relations. Now, the perception of V4 since then, since the end of 1989 and 1990, was of a region that could be important, especially for Japanese investments, because it's got a lot of low-paid but skilled workers in a workforce. So that's why there was quite a few Japanese investment in V4 countries. But I believe that politically it can only be important or interesting for Japan as members of the EU. And without closer integrations within the EU, I don't think that Japan would be very much interested in dealing with V4 in a, well, let's say, closer political institutionalized framework. Well, with China, perhaps it might be perceived as a little bit of balancing, and it's true that, for instance, Japanese politicians, embassies in the V4 countries have been trying to, I wouldn't say contain Chinese, for instance, cultural actions here, but they've been conducting their policies with regard to Chinese influence in the V4 countries. With the Republic of Korea, I don't think that there is any balancing happening. I think it's more of a competition, but competition there is, and that's true because, there are quite some similarities between Japanese and Korean economy and investment, and within the region as well. So in this sense, I think that not only these two countries are competing for the market, but also the V4 countries are competing to attract the investments of both, Republic of Korea and Japan. I personally am not very, very optimistic about institutionalization of the Japan V4 format because, well, first, I think that there's quite some differences within the V4 itself as far as like their strategic cultures and even national interests or foreign interests, which are problematic for Japan, surely, and also sort of like hamper the cohesiveness of the group. But also economically, they are competitors, to Japan. So. Among themselves, like, Czech Republic is competing with Slovakia to attract Japanese investment. I don't think that the framework, even though it's working now, and I think it's working okay, there are some political coordination, there is some, scientific ODA sort of coordination and cooperation. I think that this is some development that's quite good, for the V4 Japan framework, but I'm not quite positive about like where it's going to go. I don't think that it will turn into some form of institutionalized framework. And this is the same idea I have about the 16 or 17 plus 1 with China. It's also quite like diverse group of countries that it's quite complicated to, sort of agree on a lot of deep topics. Well, if there's a gap of perception of V4 countries between Japan and China, I think there is. I think there's a huge gap of perception. Now, China is perceived quite a lot in these countries as someone with a future, you know, as someone who's going to bring all the investment, and that's why it's so popular That's why a lot of V4 countries are very open to Chinese investment and to Chinese influence in Europe, especially Hungary, for instance. Hungary's foreign policy towards China is very much open and I think also counterproductive because Chinese investment in V4 countries are much smaller than Japanese investment or even Korean investment in those V4 countries. But at the same time, even though Japan has been in the Czech Republic the #2 investor for like a decade or even more, and in all the other V4 countries as well, Japan and Korea invest quite a lot of money. They don't seem to be regarded as highly or like as perspective as China is, and this is quite something that I don't really understand. Even though the values that we share with Japan are much more similar than the values we share with China. So in this sense, I think there's quite a big gap of perception of what Japan and China can do in V4 countries, and I believe that all of these like V4 countries should. I think pay more attention to both Japan and the Republic of Korea as opposed to like the Chinese government or Chinese influence we have here.